He never slept easy, not even back then, when he was untouchable, feared, respected. Albert Anastasia would lay back in his silk-sheeted bed, cigar ash still fresh on the tray, and stare into the ceiling like it owed him something. He had everything a man could want: power, cash, loyalty. But peace? That was never part of the deal. That's the thing nobody tells you about becoming a king in a world built on bullets. You don't get silence. You get echoes. Brooklyn was different in the early 30s. The dock smelled like oil, blood, and ambition. Albert didn't rise from a clean place. He came through Ellis Island like every other broke Italian kid, but he had something in him that the others didn't. He didn't wait for opportunities. He took them, forcefully. His hands were good at killing before they were good at anything else. He didn't mind the mess. In fact, part of him liked it. The first body he dropped? Some punk longshoreman who called him a dirty wop and laughed too loud when he said it, that was all it took. One steel pipe to the back of the skull, one boot to the ribs, and that mouth never said another word. No one missed the guy. And Albert? He didn't flinch. He slept like a stone that night, but that was before the ghosts got loud. By the time the bosses started whispering about an execution squad, Albert was already knee-deep in blood. They needed someone who didn't blink, someone who wouldn't ask questions. They handed him contracts like they were handing out dinner menus, and he always delivered. Not because he hated the men he killed. Truth is, he didn't even think of them as people. They were names on paper. And once that paper burned, they burned too. Murder Incorporated wasn't a myth. It was a damn machine. Albert built it brick by brick, body by body. He trained boys to kill clean, no mess, no drama. He taught them silence, patience, and to never look their targets in the eyes. He said, "You look into a man's soul before you put him down. You risk seeing yourself." That wasn't philosophy. That was fear. His own fear. The kind you bury so deep it starts whispering to you when the lights go out. They called him the Lord High Executioner, like it was some badge of honor. And maybe, for a while, he wore it proud. But there's a line, one you don't see until it's already behind you. You step over it the day you stop remembering the names of the men you've buried. That day came for Albert, long before he admitted it. Still, he never showed weakness, not in the streets, not in front of the boys, not even in the mirror. But alone, in the dark, when the city buzz died down and the clubs went quiet, that's when it hit. That's when the nightmares showed up. Bloody hands, screaming mouths, eyes wide open, accusing. He'd wake up sweating, heart racing like someone was about to put two in his chest. His wife thought it was just business stress. She never asked questions. That's why he kept her. But even she started noticing the way he sat up in bed, looking over his shoulder like someone might be there. Nobody could sneak up on Albert, not in real life, but in his dreams. They were always waiting. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the guilt he didn't want to admit was guilt. He called it nerves. He said things were heating up, the feds, the rats, the jealous eyes. But deep down, he knew what it really was. It was everything he buried clawing its way back. He looked calm in the day. Sharp suits, straight spine, clean hands. But night told the truth. And the truth was, the Lord High Executioner hadn't really slept in years. The sun meant nothing to Albert. He didn't care if it rose or not. He lived in that space between dusk and midnight, the hours when decent people locked their doors and filth came alive. Brooklyn was never quiet, but it had its own rhythm. And Albert had learned to move with it. Every street had a memory. Every corner a body or a deal or a betrayal. It was a graveyard painted over with laughter, whores, and jazz. And Albert? He was the undertaker pretending to be a king. His mornings, if you could call them that, started late. He didn't wake from sleep. He rose from exhaustion. The sheets were always twisted, soaked. The window blinds always slightly cracked, like he needed to see the street in case someone came for him. No one did, not yet. But it wasn't paranoia if they really wanted your head. He walked into the bathroom, the marble cold under his bare feet. The man in the mirror looked tired. Not weak, never weak, just older. More hunted than Hunter, but his eyes still burned. That was the difference between Albert and the rest of them. They aged, They softened. They doubted. He didn't. Not on the outside. There was a knock on the front door. 2 quick raps. That was the signal. Someone loyal. He pulled on his shirt, still buttoning it as he walked barefoot across the penthouse. When he opened the door, it was Tommy, one of the few he trusted, if trust was even a word in Albert's world. Tommy had been with him since the docks, back when they ran the waterfront with iron fists and broken bones. He wasn't smart, but he was loyal. The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate if you asked him to bury a priest. "Morning, boss," Tommy said, stepping inside without waiting for an invite. "It ain't morning," Albert muttered, rubbing his jaw. Tommy glanced around like he always did. Habit, not caution. "That thing on 43rd? It's done. The guy won't be talking no more." Albert didn't ask for details. He never did. He didn't need to know how many bullets, or if the guy begged. He just needed to know the job was finished. "You leave a mess?" Tommy shrugged. "Not enough for a janitor to cry about." Albert nodded. That was good enough. "Any blowback?" "Maybe," Tommy scratched at his neck. "I heard Lewis from East Harlem's been asking around. Said something about you cutting too close to his turf." Albert's face didn't change, but his silence had weight. "He ain't serious," Tommy added, "just mouthing off. You want me to—" "No," Albert cut him off. "Let him talk. Let him feel safe." That was the thing about Albert. He didn't strike when people expected it. He let you think you were safe, let you talk, let you eat. Then he'd visit you during dessert and wipe your smile off with a napkin soaked in red. Tommy lingered, uneasy. Albert noticed. "What?" he asked. "You been sleeping?" Tommy asked, eyes cautious, like he knew he was overstepping but had to ask. Albert gave him a long look. "Don't start." Tommy held up his hands. "Just saying. You look tired." Albert leaned in close. Tired men still pull triggers. Remember that. Tommy nodded, swallowed hard, and left without another word. Once alone, Albert walked back to his bedroom. He opened the drawer beside his bed and pulled out the little bottle of pills the doc had given him, something to help calm the mind. Albert stared at it. He hated taking anything that dulled his edge. A dull edge gets you killed in his world. But sometimes, the voices in his head were louder than the city outside. He didn't take one. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the phone. He had a meeting that night, one of the big ones, the commission. All the heads were coming in, and they wanted to talk about the recent messes. Albert knew what they meant. Too many bodies, too much heat. But that's what they had him for. He cleaned up their problems, their enemies, their traitors. He was the devil they paid to keep their hands clean. But devils don't stay loyal forever. That night, the meeting was in a quiet cigar lounge in Midtown. Private, expensive, secure. Albert arrived in a black suit, shoes shining like wet glass. The air inside smelled like power and rot. Men who smiled with knives under their coats. Men who shook hands like they were testing your bones for weakness. The bosses were already seated when he arrived. Carlo from the Bronx, Gallo from Queens, and Vincent from Jersey. All old faces, all men Albert had helped protect, and if needed, bury. "Albert," Carlo said, giving him a thin smile. "You're late." "I'm alive," Albert replied, sitting down. "That's worth more." The tension was thick. Gallo leaned forward. "This thing with the East Harlem kid, you handling it?" "I always handle it," Albert said. "Your crew's been a little loud lately," Vincent chimed in. "Cops are sniffing around again? That's not good for business." Albert lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slow. "Business is messy. You want clean, open a bakery." Carlo smirked. "We just want calm. The papers are printing too many bodies. The DA is getting pressure." Albert flicked ash into a tray shaped like a skull. "You want less bodies? Stop giving me names." That shut them up for a moment, but it was clear. Something had shifted. The way they looked at him, it wasn't with fear, not the same kind. It was calculation, like they were weighing his worth, like they were thinking about a future without him in it. Albert felt it in his bones, the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. He smiled anyway. "You want calm? I'll give you calm." That was a lie. On his way out, one of the younger guys brushed past him without saying a word. No eye contact. No respect. That hadn't happened in years. Albert stopped walking, turned. "You forget something, kid?" The young man froze. "Sir?" Albert stepped close. "You don't walk past me like I'm wallpaper. You don't breathe near me without respect." The kid nodded quickly. "Sorry, sir." Albert grabbed his shoulder and leaned in. "Don't be sorry. Be gone." He let him go and walked out. But he knew. That was the crack. The beginning. When fear fades, respect follows. And when that goes, the bullets come next. Back in the car, the city lights blurred through the tinted windows. He closed his eyes for just a second, and that's when he saw her again. The woman in the red dress. She wasn't real. She never was. But in his dreams, she always stood at the end of a hallway, smiling, bleeding, mouth moving with no sound, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. He jerked awake, heart pounding, sweat on his neck. His driver didn't notice, or pretended not to. Albert stared out the window. "You see ghosts. You're already halfway in the grave," his old mentor used to say. Albert didn't believe in ghosts, but they believed in him. The past doesn't ask for permission when it comes crawling back. It shows up, uninvited, reeking of things you thought you'd buried. That night, after the meeting, Albert sat alone in his study, the lights dimmed low, the whiskey in his hand untouched. He wasn't a man who liked memories, but some nights they kicked the door open anyway. He was 12 when he first learned what betrayal smelled like. Salt water and rust. That's how the docks smelled in Tropea back in southern Italy. His father was a fisherman, a hard, mean man with calloused hands and a belt that never stayed on his pants long enough. It was always swinging at someone, mostly Albert's mother, sometimes Albert himself. Food was scarce, affection even more so. But Albert didn't complain. Complaining was for weak boys. And weak boys ended up dead in alleyways or disappeared into the sea with rocks tied to their feet. He learned early to keep his back straight, his fists tight, and his mouth shut. At 9, he stole bread from a local vendor and got caught. The man dragged him to his father, expecting a scolding. What he got instead was a boot to the stomach, and Albert's first lesson: never get caught. At 12, his older brother Marco disappeared. Just gone one day. No goodbye, no warning. The rumor was that Marco had stolen money from one of the local camorristi, one of the men who ran the region's black markets. The body was never found, but the message was loud enough. Loyalty was more valuable than blood. Albert never forgave Marco, not for dying, but for leaving him behind, for being stupid, for getting caught. By 14, Albert was already working the docks, running messages, carrying crates, sometimes carrying knives. The local smugglers liked him because he didn't talk, didn't smile, didn't whine. He watched the older boys, watched who got slapped, who got praised, who vanished, and he learned. He studied power like other kids studied scripture. At 15, he slit a man's throat. The man had touched a girl who was under one of the local boss's protection. A nothing girl. A poor girl. But she was property, and property gets defended. Albert didn't hesitate. He followed the man into the alley, slid the blade from behind, and held his mouth shut as he bled out. Cold, quick, no drama. He didn't feel anything. No fear, no guilt. Just the warmth of the blood and the sense that he had finally done something right. The boss sent him 5 lira and a pair of new boots. Albert didn't care about the money. He cared that someone had noticed. That was how you got out. That was how you stopped being invisible. By 17, his mother put him on a ship to America, said the police were sniffing around and she didn't want to lose another son. Albert never looked back. He didn't kiss her cheek. He didn't cry. He just got on the boat and told himself that the next time someone tried to control his life, he'd put them in the dirt. Brooklyn in the 1920s wasn't a city. It was a war zone. Every block had a price. Every shopkeeper paid tribute. Immigrants ran the streets, cops looked the other way, and blood spilled daily over corners and crates. Albert didn't come with a name, just fists and ambition. He started with nothing. A cot in a basement, meals that came from charity lines or dice games. But it didn't take long for him to find work. The docks needed muscle, and Albert had plenty. He broke strikes, cracked skulls, and didn't blink when a man begged. That's how he met Louis the Mouth Scolari, a loud, rat-faced man who saw in Albert what most missed: usefulness. Louis introduced him to Joe Masseria, who ran half the rackets in Brooklyn at the time. Joe needed boys who didn't ask questions, boys who could make someone disappear without leaving a trace. Albert didn't hesitate. Within months, he was collecting payments, silencing rivals, and running small crews. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He didn't chase skirts like the others. That was his edge. He didn't need to be liked. He just needed to be feared. And feared he was. But fear comes at a cost. One night, Louis brought him along to collect from a small-time car joint owner who'd missed his payments 2 weeks in a row. The guy was shaking when he opened the door, claimed his wife was sick, that the money had gone to the hospital. Louis laughed in his face. Albert watched silently. Then the guy did something stupid. He reached under the counter. Albert didn't wait. 2 bullets, one to the chest, one to the throat. He fell backwards, blood spraying against the wall like spilled wine. Louis was frozen. Jesus, kid. He was going for a gun, Albert said flatly. Louis nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. But Albert had seen it. The guy wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was grabbing an envelope, probably full of the money they were there to collect. Albert had killed too fast. But he didn't regret it. Regret was for people who weren't trying to climb. Back in the present, Albert snapped out of the memory as the grandfather clock in his study chimed softly. 3 a.m. He poured himself a drink. Still no pills. Still no sleep. His phone rang. Only a few people had that number. He answered. You alone? The voice asked. Albert recognized it instantly. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld. Polished, calculated, dangerous. If Albert was a blade, Frank was the scalpel. I'm listening, Albert said. There's talk, Frank said. From the inside. Always is. Not this kind. Your name's coming up too often. Some of the boys think you're going too far, that you're making enemies faster than you can bury them. Albert didn't respond right away. He let silence do the talking. Frank sighed. I'm not your enemy, Albert. You know that. But I'm telling you, cool the fire, or you'll get burned. Albert chuckled darkly. They send you to warn me? No, Frank said. I sent myself. Because I know what happens when you get cornered, and I don't want to be anywhere near it. The line went dead. Albert stared at the phone. He could already smell it, betrayal. The same scent he'd known since the docks in Italy. When men start whispering, it means they've already decided to sharpen their knives. And Albert knew one thing for sure. He'd never go down clean. He reached into his desk and pulled out a list. 10 names, men he didn't trust anymore. Men who had stopped looking him in the eyes during meetings. One of them was going to try something. He didn't know which yet, but it didn't matter. He'd get to them all eventually. That morning, he took a drive to the ocean. Not for peace, not for reflection. He just needed to breathe something that didn't stink of cigars and backroom deals. The Atlantic wind hit hard, cold, honest, brutal, like him. He walked the shore, coat pulled tight, staring out at the waves. Somewhere out there was the same sea he'd crossed as a boy, the same sea his brother may have been dumped in. So many things lost to the water. Albert knelt down, picked up a smooth stone, and tossed it. It skipped twice, sank. He watched the ripples fade. His eyes were tired, but not soft. He turned and walked back to the car. He still had work to do. Albert's penthouse sat high above the city, but he never felt elevated. Not really. It was just a place where the walls whispered quieter, where the screams couldn't reach him. But even up there, something had shifted. The silence was heavier, the air thicker. Paranoia wasn't a moment anymore. It was a constant state. He wasn't a man who kept family close. Most of them had been left behind in Italy, rotted or forgotten. But he had one living link left, his younger cousin, Nino. A street-smart punk who'd been tagging along for years, too soft for frontline work, but loyal. At least, that's what Albert used to think. Now, even that was starting to rot. It started with a whisper. A few weeks back, a crew down in Bensonhurst got hit. Fast, surgical, quiet. Cash gone, drugs gone, no one dead. Normally, that would have been a police job or a rival family testing waters. But one of Albert's informants had caught something strange. One of the getaway drivers had a limp, just like Nino. Albert didn't act immediately. He waited. He watched. He believed in patience, but not mercy. That morning he sat in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, cigarette burning low between two fingers. Nino came in late, smelling like cologne and sweat, trying to hide a hangover with fake energy. "Morning, cuz," Nino said, flashing that lazy grin. "You eat yet?" Albert didn't look up. "Sit down." Something in his tone froze Nino halfway through pouring coffee. He slowly dropped into the chair across from Albert, suddenly unsure of his own voice. Albert slid a photo across the table. Grainy, black and white, a man stepping into a truck, the limp unmistakable. "You been in Bensonhurst lately?" Albert asked, calm but cold. Nino blinked. "Nah, I've been sticking around the Heights. Ain't been down there in—" "Don't lie." Nino's mouth opened, then closed. Albert leaned in. "If you're gonna lie to me, Nino, make it good. You think I got to where I am by not seeing rats when they twitch?" Nino's hands started to shake. "It wasn't what you think." "Then what was it?" "I needed cash," Nino whispered. "You said I wasn't ready to run a crew. Said I needed more time, more discipline. But I've been in this life since I was 16, and I'm still taking scraps. I figured, hit a small job, no blood, just cash. Nobody gets hurt." Albert stared at him for a long time. "Nobody gets hurt?" "It was clean, Albert. I swear to God, I kept your name out of it. I just needed something to show I could do more." Albert rose from the table, slow. "You wanted to prove yourself by robbing me blind." Nino looked up, horrified. No, I didn't know it was your stash. You hit any crew under me, it's me you're stealing from." Albert walked to the window, exhaled smoke. The city looked gray, distant. "I told your father I'd look out for you. When he died, I made a promise. But I didn't promise to protect a thief." Nino stood now, desperate. "Albert, please." Albert turned fast, gun drawn, hammer back. Nino froze. The silence was electric. Even the city noise outside seemed to hold its breath. "I should kill you," Albert said. "Right here. You know that, don't you?" Nino's voice cracked. "I know. But I won't," Albert muttered, lowering the gun. "Because you're still blood. And because I want you to live with what you've done." Albert stepped close, eyes locked on Nino's. "You're out. Done. You so much as step into a poker game with one of my guys, I'll cut your throat myself." Nino didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes wet, mouth shaking. Albert watched him go. That was the thing about betrayal. It never came from strangers. It wore familiar faces. It smiled at your dinner table. And it always came with reasons. But reasons didn't matter when your empire was built on fear. You let one betrayal slide, the whole kingdom starts slipping. Later that night, Albert paid a visit to the old warehouse off McDonald Avenue. It was one of his oldest spots. Used to be a coffin factory before the family bought it up and turned it into a cash hold, weapons cache, an emergency cleanup site. He didn't go there for nostalgia. He went because Gallo was there, one of the three heads from the commission meeting, and the one who smiled the most fake. Gallo had sent word. A peace offering. Wanted to talk things over after the tension in Midtown. Albert didn't trust peace offerings. They usually came with ambushes. But he showed anyway, because walking into a trap with your eyes open was better than waiting for it to come to you blind. The warehouse smelled like oil and memory. The old machinery was still there, rusted and skeletal. Gallo stood near a table, 2 glasses of scotch already poured. Albert stepped in slow, hands out, no weapon drawn. "You call, I come. Must be important." Gallo grinned. "I don't like bad blood, Albert. Never did." Albert glanced around. Empty, for now. "You forget," he said. "I made my name from bad blood." Gallo laughed, sipped his drink. "We've all spilled our share." Albert didn't touch the glass. He just stood there, watching, waiting. "I'll get to it," Gallo said finally. "Word is, some of the younger guys, your guys, been mouthing off, saying you're losing your grip, that you're paranoid, that you're unstable. Albert didn't flinch. I am paranoid. That's why I'm still alive. You know what I mean, Gallo pressed. They're saying you're making enemies inside the family, that you're a danger to all of us. Albert stepped forward, close enough to see the fear twitch behind Gallo's smile. You ever think, Albert said slowly, maybe I am the danger? Gallo's grin cracked. Albert leaned in. Let me tell you something. I've been in this game since your mother was selling cakes to sailors. I've killed more men than you've had drinks. And every time someone thought I was done, I buried them and lit a cigar on their grave. The silence was thick. Gallo cleared his throat. Nobody's trying to replace you, Albert. Albert pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flipped it open, calm, surgical. You sure? He asked. Because if they are, now's a good time to start praying. Gallo nodded fast, suddenly pale. Albert smiled, then pocketed the blade. We're good then. He turned and walked out. Back at home, he finally took the pills, not to sleep, but to slow the voices, just for a night. But dreams came anyway. He saw Marco, his brother, still 17, face half rotted from the sea, holding a knife, asking a question Albert couldn't hear. He woke before sunrise. Another night without rest, another night closer to the edge, and Albert knew peace was never going to come. Not for him. Because when you're the Lord High Executioner, the only real silence comes when the barrel touches your own head. And even then, the ghosts might still talk. The first time someone tried to kill Albert Anastasia, he was 19. It was a butcher's boy from Red Hook with shaky hands and a kitchen knife tucked behind his apron. Albert had gone in for his usual cut of pork, made a joke about the kid's greasy face, and turned his back for half a second. The blade never landed. Albert caught the reflection in the freezer door. He took the kid down hard, broke 3 ribs and put the knife through his palm just to send a message. Then he left the shop without a word. That day, he learned something that stayed with him his whole life. The hit doesn't always come from the front. Now, more than 2 decades later, that lesson echoed louder than ever. It started with a flat tire. Albert didn't drive much himself anymore. He had men for that. But that morning, against habit, he told his driver to take the day off, said he wanted to breathe a little, alone. That kind of behavior wasn't like him, and maybe that's what saved him. He was cruising down Flatbush in a matte black Packard, windows cracked, jazz low on the radio, when the car jolted hard to the right. Front passenger tire gone. He coasted to a slow stop just outside a narrow alley. He stepped out, checking the wheel. Shredded clean. Not a nail, not a puncture. It looked cut. His spine tensed. Albert wasn't a mechanic, but he'd seen sabotage before. Back in the war, when guys would slice brake lines just for laughs. This wasn't amateur work. This was a message. Or worse, an invitation. He stood still for a beat too long. That's when he saw it. A glint in the 3rd-floor window across the alley. Barely a flicker. But he knew the flash of a scope when he saw one, and that kind of glass didn't belong to photographers. He didn't think. He moved. The shot rang out a split second later, blasting into the driver's side of the Packard. Glass shattered. Metal screamed. Albert dove behind the car, drawing his Colt like it was second nature. He kept low, eyes scanning. 2 more shots came. One cracked the side mirror, the other ripped through the hood. Whoever was up there was serious. Patient, professional, not street trash. He waited until there was a pause, then darted to the other side of the alley, ducking into the narrow crawl space behind a stack of garbage bins. The shooter was good, but not good enough to track him through metal and brick. Albert didn't run. He didn't yell. He waited. And that was the difference between men like him and everyone else. Patience under fire. After 3 minutes of silence, the shooter must have thought he was done. A rookie mistake. Albert circled the block, came in through the back of the neighboring building, kicked open the rusted stairwell door, and climbed slow, quiet, gun steady in his hand. 3rd floor. Door ajar. He stepped inside. The place smelled like mold and cigarettes. A small table, a tripod, a rifle still warm. But no shooter. The window was open. Albert looked out. saw the fire escape swaying. He'd missed him by seconds, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the how. A scoped rifle, a planned blowout, a vantage point. This wasn't a street beef. This wasn't personal. This was sanctioned. Albert picked up the shell casing and pocketed it. Somebody had paid for that shot, which meant somebody inside the circle wanted him gone. Back at the penthouse, Albert didn't call anyone. He didn't scream. He didn't rant. That wasn't his style. Rage was a luxury. Controlled fury, that was currency. He poured a drink, lit a cigarette, and stared at the skyline while blood slowly dried on the cuff of his sleeve. He didn't think about death. He'd already made peace with it years ago. What burned wasn't the attempt. It was the insult, the disrespect, that someone thought they could take a shot at him and not finish the job. He sat down, pulled out a blank notepad, and wrote one word in the center: inside. Then a name came next: Gallo. Too ambitious, too talkative, too eager at that commission meeting. Then another. Costello? Number too careful. Costello would have poisoned his drink or waited for the cops to do the job. He wasn't reckless. Then a third. Tommy. Albert's jaw tightened. Tommy had known about the East Harlem turf tension before anyone else. He had access, and he hadn't checked the car that morning. Usually did. Always did. But Albert still wasn't sure. Tommy was dumb, not disloyal, at least not before now. He needed answers, not guesses. And there was only one man who specialized in pulling rats from walls: Louis T. They used to call him Louis the Latch back in the day, because once he got a hold of you, he never let go. Louis wasn't part of the modern machine anymore. He'd gone underground in the late 40s after a wiretap scandal nearly landed half the commission in prison. But Albert kept him on the payroll for moments like this. The man could make priests talk in confession. Albert found him at a junkyard near Coney Island. Louis had a small trailer behind 2 rusted Cadillacs and a pit bull named Grease. The dog didn't bark as Albert approached. It just watched him with that dead-eyed loyalty Albert had always respected in animals, more than in people. Louis stepped out, still wearing the same oil-stained overalls he probably hadn't washed in 5 years. His beard had gone full white, but his eyes were sharp. "Didn't think you'd ever need me again," Louis said, flicking a cigarette into a bucket. "I need to know who wants me dead," Albert said bluntly. Louis nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. "I'll need a name to start." Albert handed over the list he'd scribbled. 3 names, 3 possibilities. Louis scanned it. "You still trust people too long, Albert?" "No," Albert said coldly. "I just let them feel safe until I'm ready." Louis smiled. "You want them shaken or broken?" Albert didn't answer. He didn't have to. Louis grinned. "Right, I'll call you in 3 days." 3 days later, the phone rang at dawn. Albert was already awake. "Tommy," Louis said simply. He was paid off by someone close to Gallo, been pocketing side cash, feeding whispers. Albert closed his eyes, not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. Betrayal never came wearing enemy colors. It wore the jacket you gave them, sat at the table you paid for, laughed at your jokes while plotting your funeral. He hung up the phone and dialed a second number. Tommy answered, groggy. "Boss, you good?" Albert's voice was calm. "Meet me at the warehouse, 20 minutes. No excuses." Tommy hesitated. "Sure. Everything all right?" "Just business," Albert said. And then he hung up. The warehouse was silent. Albert stood near the old assembly table, the same spot where he'd warned Gallo just a few nights back. Tommy walked in 15 minutes later, wearing that same dumb loyalty in his eyes. "What's the job, boss?" Albert lit a cigarette. "You still carrying?" Tommy patted his side. "Always." Albert stepped closer. "Good. You'll need it." Tommy's smile faded. "Boss?" Albert looked him straight in the eyes. "Why'd you do it?" Tommy blinked. "Do what?" Albert pulled the gun from his coat. "Don't insult me." Tommy raised his hands. "Albert, I swear, whatever you heard, it's a lie." Albert fired once through the thigh. Tommy dropped, howling. "You sold me out," Albert said, standing over him. "To Gallo?" "For what? A bigger cut, more respect?" Tommy clutched his leg, face pale. "It wasn't like that." Gallo said you were slipping, said the commission was going to replace you anyway. Albert crouched beside him. And you believed him? Tommy sobbed. I thought if I warned him, maybe I could. Albert fired again, through the other leg. No one replaces me, he said flatly. Tommy screamed. Albert stood. The gun smoked. Bleed slow, he said, walking out. Tommy wouldn't die. Not yet. Someone would find him, patch him up, but he'd never walk right again. Just like betrayal, the limp would stay forever. Albert returned home, poured a drink, and stared out at the skyline. Now he knew the players. Now he was done waiting. And somewhere out there, Gallo had just become a dead man walking. Because the Lord High Executioner wasn't tired anymore. He was awake. And he was angry. The thing about war was, it rarely started with bullets. The first shot was always silence, the kind that settled heavy in the air just before the screaming began. Albert knew that silence well. He could smell it now, taste it. It was in his coffee, in the wind that whipped through Brooklyn's gutters, in the way people avoided his eyes when he walked into a room. Something had changed. It wasn't just Tommy's betrayal. That was only a symptom. The real disease was deeper, slower, an infection spreading through the core of his empire. Whispers behind his back, looks exchanged in smoke-filled corners. Even men who had stood by him for decades were now hedging their bets, making side deals, playing both sides. Cowards. But cowards didn't get warnings, they got lessons. Albert sat in his study that morning with a black notebook in front of him. 10 names, each one circled. All of them had either taken Gallo's money, fed intel to outsiders, or stood by and said nothing when others did. Men who thought fear had an expiration date. They were wrong. Albert didn't kill them all at once. That would have been theatrical, sloppy. He wasn't a butcher. He was an architect of endings. He picked the one name that mattered most for impact. Frankie Spano. Not because he was the worst, but because he was the loudest. Frankie had swaggered through clubs lately like a man who knew something Albert didn't. He laughed too hard, bragged too much, like he was already living in the post-Anastasia world. Albert figured he needed a reminder that Albert Anastasia was still the storm. That night, Frankie walked into the Velvet Room, a speakeasy tucked behind a dry cleaners on Lafayette, velvet drapes, jazz piano, cigars, and whiskey. The kind of place where deals were made between mouthfuls of steak and sin. He didn't see the two men waiting by the back entrance. They came at him smooth, one on each arm, and dragged him into the alley before he could yell. Nobody interfered. That's how these things worked. 10 minutes later, the music inside paused, just briefly. A single gunshot echoed through the walls like thunder wrapped in silk. By the time police arrived, Frankie Spano's body was slumped beside a trash can, a single bullet between the eyes and a tooth stuffed into his suit pocket. Albert's signature, a reminder to all, bite the hand that feeds you and it'll come back to take your head. By morning, the streets were buzzing, not in rebellion, in fear. That's what Albert wanted. He knew how the psychology worked. Men like Gallo operated on momentum, on the idea that change was inevitable, so why not be ahead of it? Albert's bullets shattered that illusion. Now nobody knew what was coming, which made them hesitate. And hesitation? That was the difference between breathing and bleeding in this life. Later that day, Albert met with Costello, not because he trusted him, but because he needed to understand the depth of the rot. And Costello always knew where the bodies were buried, even if he didn't dig the holes himself. They met at a church, not inside. Albert didn't go into churches unless someone was dead or bleeding. They sat on a bench near the back lot, where the city's noise was kept at arm's length by the stone walls and silence of the dead. Costello lit a cigarette with careful fingers. "You made your point with Spano." Albert didn't respond. He never confirmed hits. Everyone already knew anyway. "You stir things up like that," Costello said, exhaling. "Makes the commission nervous." Albert looked at him. They weren't nervous when Gallo was putting rifles in windows. "Different kind of war," Costello said. "Yours is loud. His is quiet. They prefer quiet." Albert chuckled bitterly. "That's because they don't live with targets on their backs." Costello didn't argue. Albert turned to him. "You backing Gallo?" Costello didn't flinch. "I don't back anyone. I survive." Albert nodded. That was honest. And honesty was rare. Costello continued, Gallo's not stupid. He won't come for you directly. He'll chip away, take your people, your territory, make you look weak. He won't get far, Albert said. Maybe, Costello replied. But every time you make a move, the feds close in. The DA wants a headline. You give him bodies, he gives them court dates. Albert's eyes narrowed. Let them come. I've danced with lawmen longer than you've had silk ties. Costello stubbed his cigarette. Just remember, Albert, when kings fall, it's not the sword that gets them, it's the whispers. Albert watched him walk away. He wasn't wrong. But Albert wasn't done yet. That night, Albert returned to his penthouse with more questions than answers. The city outside seemed quieter. Or maybe it was just his ears, tired from years of listening for betrayals. He poured a drink, took off his jacket, and sat by the window. The skyline looked like a painting. Beautiful, distant, fake. Then a knock. 3 slow taps, then 2 fast. His signal. He opened the door and found Vincenzo, one of the old guard. A man who'd been with him since the early days of Murder Inc. and Sharp, silent, deadly. A ghost with a heartbeat. Albert waved him in. Vincenzo didn't sit. He rarely did. What do you know? Albert asked. Vincenzo handed him a photo. Grainy, blurred. Gallo with someone. Albert studied the man beside him. Young, slick, unfamiliar. Who is he? Out-of-town hitter? Cuban? Real name's Angel Mendez. Works clean, fast. 2 hits in Miami, 1 in Philly. All confirmed. Gallo brought him in through the docks, slipped under radar. Albert nodded slowly. So he's next. Vincenzo didn't ask questions, just took the photo and left. By sunrise, Angel Mendez was dead. Poisoned, fast, clean. His coffee laced with enough strychnine to make his last breath sound like a song choking on itself. Albert didn't even flinch when he heard. He just nodded. One more piece off the board. The message was clear now. You come into my city, you leave in a box, but behind every move, Albert could feel the weight building, not from his enemies, from the inside. He knew what was happening. He was being boxed in. The law was circling. The commission was hedging bets. Gallo was bleeding the edges, and he was bleeding something else too. Sleep. It had been 4 nights now, 4 nights without real rest. The pills didn't work anymore. The ghosts talked louder than ever. Frankie, Tommy, Marco, his father. They all came in fragments, flashing in shadows, echoing in the walls, and the red dress girl. Always the red dress girl. She never spoke. She just stood there, bleeding from the mouth, like she wanted to ask something he couldn't hear. Albert sat at the edge of his bed, breathing hard, shirt soaked through. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. He couldn't afford to slip, not now. He went to the mirror, looked into his own face, and didn't recognize the man staring back. But he still had one thing left, control. And as long as he held that, he wasn't finished. The city was twitching. Albert could feel it in the way the streets moved. More eyes on him now, more whispers. The tension wasn't just in the underworld, it was everywhere. The cops were crawling like roaches, the newspapers were printing veiled threats disguised as rumors, and the commission was watching him like a sick lion pacing in a cage. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to slip, to act out, make a scene, get sloppy. But Albert wasn't raised sloppy. He was raised in blood and silence, born in a place where one wrong glance could get you stabbed with a fishhook behind a church. He had survived too many winters, too many betrayals to start bleeding now. Still, something had to be done. Not quiet, not subtle, not surgical. Something loud. To remind them all what happened when you bet against a man who built his empire on the backs of corpses. And Albert had just the name in mind. Nicky Mancuso. A mid-tier enforcer with a big mouth and small spine. Lately, he'd been slipping into clubs and parties, getting drunk, throwing Gallo's name around like a badge, bragging about how Albert's time was ticking down. Albert didn't need spies to confirm it. The streets were loud enough. They wanted to see if he still had it in him. If the Lord High Executioner had turned into just another aging boss hiding behind tinted windows, he'd give them a show. The plan was simple. Find Nicky, make it public, make it brutal, not just to kill. Anyone could do that. Albert wanted the city to hear it. So he waited. 2 days later, word came down that Nicky would be at Club Rialto, a loud, glitzy mess in Midtown, a place full of gamblers, girls, and guys who thought wearing a silk tie made them invincible. Albert didn't send a crew. He went himself. At 11:52 p.m., the doors opened. Albert walked in like death in a suit. The place didn't go quiet, but it felt like the air changed. Men straightened up, girls stopped mid-laugh. Even the band hit a note that didn't belong. He moved through the crowd without saying a word. Eyes followed him. No one dared speak. At the back near a corner booth, Nicky was grinning with 2 girls on his lap and a glass of bourbon in hand. When he saw Albert, the grin faltered. Albert didn't say anything. He simply sat across from him. The girls looked confused, nervous. Albert looked at Nicky, dead in the eyes. "You've been doing a lot of talking," he said. Nicky's throat clicked. "It's just talk, boss. You know how it is." Albert nodded. "I do." Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a small revolver, and placed it on the table. He pushed it toward Nicky. "Pick it up," Albert said calmly. The girls scrambled away from the booth, screaming. People started backing up, unsure if they were about to witness history or carnage, or both. Nicky stared at the gun. "Boss, come on!" Albert's voice dropped. "Pick it up." Nicky's hand trembled as he reached for it. As soon as he touched the grip, Albert stood and grabbed him by the wrist, slamming the back of his head into the wall. Once, twice. Then he pulled out his own piece and shot Nicky through the mouth. Blood hit the wall like red graffiti. People screamed. Someone ran. Others just stood, stunned. Albert turned to the crowd. "This is what happens when you forget who built this city," he said. Voice steady, loud enough for everyone. He walked out before the cops could even get there. No mask, no rush. Just silence behind him. The kind of silence that comes after an earthquake. The next day, the headlines screamed, "Mob hit in Midtown. Mancuso executed in full view of crowd. Anastasia strikes again. Old blood still boils." Albert didn't read them. He didn't have to. The message had been sent. And more importantly, the commission heard it. By noon, his phone rang. It was Costello again. This time, there was no casual charm in his voice. "You know what you've done?" he asked. "I reminded them. You reminded them you're dangerous. Now the feds are mobilizing." Albert lit a cigarette. "Let them. You're pushing too hard." Albert exhaled smoke. "No such thing," Costello sighed. "We're holding a meeting. Emergency. You need to come." Albert's voice went cold. "Is Gallo going to be there?" "He'll be there." Albert hung up. It was time. The meeting was held in a wine cellar beneath a restaurant in Lower Manhattan. Private, cold, old as hell, like the bones of the city itself. Albert walked in wearing a charcoal suit, tie neat, eyes sharper than razors. Gallo was already seated, sipping wine like a Roman emperor pretending not to be afraid. The rest of the commission was scattered around the table. Old men, tired men, nervous men. Costello started. "We need to talk about last night." Albert sat. "What's there to talk about?" "You executed a soldier in public," Gallo said, his voice tight. "You brought heat, press cops." Albert looked him dead in the eye. "I executed a liar. In public. So no one else forgets who the hell I am." "You think that's leadership?" Gallo snapped. "That's desperation." Albert leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You sent a sniper after me. You've been bleeding my territory, flipping my men, whispering like a rat in a cellar. And I let it slide. For months. But this is your warning." Costello raised a hand. "Enough. We're not here to watch you two tear each other apart. We're here to stabilize the family." "The family doesn't need stability," Albert growled. "It needs a purge." Gallo stood. "You're out of control." Albert stood too. "Then do something about it." The room tensed. Everyone sat frozen. And Gallo backed down. He sat again, eyes burning, jaw tight. Costello broke the silence. "No more hits, no more press, you hear me?" Albert didn't respond, because his answer would come later, and it wouldn't be quiet. Back at the penthouse, Albert finally sat still. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like clarity. It wasn't peace. He didn't believe in peace, but it was something close. Purpose, momentum. He poured himself a drink and looked out at the city again. He was still king, but he knew the end was circling. Not because someone else was stronger, but because this life didn't let you leave. It swallowed you whole, then waited to spit you out when the paper wanted another headline. He sat back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, he slept. But not for long, because in his dreams, the girl in the red dress still waited. Only this time, she was closer, and she was holding a gun. The dream stayed with him this time. Even after he opened his eyes, even after the morning light spilled across the sheets, the image refused to leave. Her, standing in that same red dress, the hem soaked in blood, the smile gone. She had spoken this time. He couldn't remember the words, but her voice felt like glass dragging across his ribs. He sat up, soaked in sweat, the city already alive beyond the windows. Horns, sirens, life. Albert lit a cigarette and stared at the wall, the echo of her voice still there. She didn't belong to any memory he recognized, not a mistress, not a girl he'd left behind. She was something else. A symbol? A warning? Didn't matter. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a killer. He stubbed the cigarette out and got dressed. There was work to do. By noon, the feds came knocking. Not directly. They didn't kick in his door. That would have been too loud. Instead, they picked off his men one by one. Silvio Capretti, grabbed outside a butcher shop. Dino Russo, cuffed outside a hardware store, screaming about a frame-up. Angela, the Chin D'Amato, taken from a poker game mid-hand, one after another, like clockwork. They weren't being arrested for murder or racketeering, not yet. It was tax evasion, firearms, old warrants, bullshit charges, just enough to shake things up. But Albert knew what it really was. Pressure. The government didn't need to bury him under a mountain of charges. They just needed to turn the screws on the ones around him. Squeeze until someone cracked, until someone flipped. It had worked before. He knew the FBI was smarter now. They'd learned from Capone, from Luciano. They knew how to hunt without shooting. They'd let you destroy yourself. He needed to clean house. Now he met with Enzo Two-Step Bianchi that afternoon in the back of a pastry shop in Gravesend. Enzo wasn't just another earner. He was his bookkeeper, and one of the only men alive who knew exactly how much blood money had passed through Albert's hands in the last 15 years. Enzo was jittery, not because of the feds, but because he was too clean. Never pulled a trigger, never did time, just balanced the numbers, cleaned the books, and whispered updates when the heat turned up. Albert knew men like Enzo were dangerous. They were too used to the sidelines, too easy to turn when the walls started sweating. "Tell me the truth," Albert said, eyes locked on him over a cannoli and espresso. "You been talking?" Enzo blinked. "To who?" "To anyone." "I'd never." Albert raised a hand. Calm. "If I find out otherwise, Enzo, you won't get a warning. You won't see it coming. I'll put two in your spine while you're folding your socks." Enzo swallowed hard. "I swear, Albert, I'm loyal." Albert sipped his espresso, then "Prove it." Enzo blinked. "How?" "There's a Fed watching you. Lives 3 doors down from your apartment. Drives a beige Buick. You know the one?" Enzo nodded, terrified. "Burn it," Albert said. "Tonight." Enzo's eyes went wide. "What? You said you're loyal, so show me. That car's a warning. You don't send one back, they'll think we're scared." Enzo's hands trembled. Albert stood, buttoned his jacket. "You do it, or you're done. I don't care if I never see the smoke. Just make sure it burns." Then he left. He didn't wait for an answer. Because if Enzo did it, Albert could breathe a little easier. If he didn't, well, the man would disappear like ashes in the rain. Back at the penthouse, he poured himself a double. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the lighter. He stared at it. First time in years. He clenched his fist. Not fear, not yet, but something close. That night, no smoke came, no car fire, no retaliation, nothing but silence. And in that silence, Albert heard something worse than betrayal. Hesitation. By morning, he got word that Enzo had vanished, gone in the night, no trace. His wife claimed he'd gone to visit family in Buffalo. Albert didn't buy it. The man had run. Maybe to the feds, maybe to another crew. Didn't matter. He was marked now. and anyone who looked like they might follow him was next. By midweek, Albert had lost 6 more men. Not dead, just gone, ghosted. No word, no sign, no loyalty. He felt the walls coming in now, each brick another coward abandoning him. And then came the worst news yet. The commission had called another meeting. Without him. Costello called to break it gently. "We needed to move quick," he said, lying through his teeth. Albert didn't say a word. Costello filled the silence. They voted to freeze territory movements. No hits, no retaliation, not even self-defense. It's a cooling-off order. Albert laughed, low and bitter. Cooling off. Like I'm a fire they can just smother. Costello's voice tightened. "They're scared of what's coming, Albert. You're radioactive. Gallo's backing off just enough to look clean. You keep pushing, you're going to find yourself isolated." "I'm already isolated. I'm trying to keep you out of a box, brother." Albert hung up. By midnight, he sat alone in his study. Lights off, bottle half empty. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a king. He felt like a man sitting on a pile of bones with a crown made of rusted bullets. The girl in the red dress was back. Only this time, she wasn't in his dream. She was in his mind, awake, standing in the shadows of the room, bleeding from the mouth. No words, just watching, like she was counting down. Albert blinked, rubbed his eyes. When he looked again, she was gone. But he felt her still. And that terrified him more than the feds, more than Gallo, more than bullets. The next day, Albert ordered a private burial. Enzo's mother, the woman was 78, died quietly of cancer, but Enzo loved her more than anything. Albert bought her casket, then had his men follow the priest, the gravediggers, the pallbearers. He made sure Enzo's name was carved into the floral arrangement. Just one word: traitor. It wasn't a kill, it was a message. And Albert knew Enzo would see it. Maybe not today, but eventually. The dead always reached the living, and Albert would make sure no one forgot who they owed fear to. By now, even his most loyal were restless. His driver, his cook, his secretary. Everyone had eyes like they were expecting him to explode, and he felt it too. That rage, that loss of grip. But even as the walls came in, he reminded himself he had built this world. And if it came to it, he'd burn it to the ground before handing it over. It started with the noise again. Not a gunshot, not sirens, just the hum. A low, electrical hum that filled the corners of his penthouse like fog. It came at night, when the world was still and the city's growl quieted. The hum lived in the walls, in the back of his skull. Sometimes it pulsed, like a warning. Albert knew it wasn't real, but it felt real. And that was worse. He stood in front of the mirror, shirt open, chest rising and falling like he'd just finished a sprint. The scar on his ribs from the 39 warehouse ambush itched like it wanted to bleed again. He touched it lightly, fingers shaking, jaw clenched. "You're slipping," he muttered to the glass. The man in the mirror didn't argue. He had once been unshakable, cold, calculated, merciless. But lately, his thoughts didn't march in line. They scattered. One moment he was planning territory defense against Gallo. The next he was wondering if the floorboards in his penthouse could hide a body. There was no body, but he checked anyway. That was the part that scared him. The checking, the paranoia, the quiet voices. Not outside, inside. By noon, he was back in the old bakery in Red Hook, the one that used to double as a front back in the 30s. It still smelled like sugar and blood. The walls still held secrets, and Albert had stained more than one floorboard in the back with betrayal. But today, he wasn't there to bury someone. He was there to dig something up. Tony Romano, a name he hadn't heard in years. A ghost from before he'd earned the title Lord High Executioner. Tony had run with Albert when they were still boys, back when they were breaking fingers for pocket change and pretending to be bigger than they were. Then, Tony disappeared. Some said he fled to Jersey. Others whispered he got clipped by Luciano for skimming. But Albert always had a theory. Tony got smart. He saw the storm coming and stepped out before it hit. Now, after 2 decades, Tony was back. And not just anywhere. He was with Gallo. Albert didn't find that out from a soldier. He found it from a priest. Father Emilio, an old street rat turned man of God, had pulled him aside after a funeral and said quietly, "I heard a confession I shouldn't have heard." Albert had just looked at him. "Tony Romano, he's alive. He's in Gallows Circle. Says he wants to finish what you started." Albert had laughed then, sharp and joyless. That coward couldn't finish his own drink. But the laughter didn't last long, because Tony had always known things. And if he started talking, the walls wouldn't just close in, they'd collapse. Albert sat alone at the booth in the bakery's back room. The old wallpaper was curling. The table had a ring where his cigar used to burn during late-night talks. He ran his thumb across the grain of the wood. Memories flashed. Not the good kind. The first time he and Tony robbed a man, some poor bastard delivering groceries on Mulberry Street, the guy had fought back, hit Albert in the nose with a loaf of bread. Tony had laughed so hard he nearly pissed himself. That was before the blood. Before Albert realized the only currency that mattered in this world was fear. And Tony never had enough of it in him. He'd been smart, yes, slick, yes, but not hard, not like Albert. And now he was back. Why? To take credit? To cash in? Or maybe to bury the myth? Back at the penthouse, Albert called in 2 old men. Not muscle, not street dogs, killers. Men who didn't shake when the work got personal. Victor, the Stamp, Menzio and Frankie Bolano, silent partners in Murder Inc., long thought retired. Albert had kept them off the books for years, tucked away like loaded revolvers in a drawer no one dared open. Now, he opened it. They arrived at midnight. No pleasantries, no questions. Albert poured them bourbon and laid out a photo of Tony Romano clipped from a surveillance still. Grainy, but clear enough. "You remember this piece of shit?" Albert asked. Victor cracked his knuckles. "Didn't he owe us 10 grand back in '38? Albert didn't smile. "He owes us more now." Frankie took the photo. "You want him alive?" Albert shook his head. "I want him erased, fast, no message, no display. Just gone, like he never came back." The 2 men nodded. Albert walked them out, but as the door closed, he paused and said something he hadn't said in a decade. "Be careful." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Since when are we not?" Albert didn't answer, because he didn't know who he was talking to anymore. The hit never happened. 3 days passed. No bodies, no calls, no sign of Victor or Frankie. Albert's stomach twisted. He sent someone to check Victor's apartment. Empty. Lights still on. Frankie's place? Same. Nothing stolen. No blood. Just silence. Like they'd been vacuumed off the earth. Albert stood in the middle of his office and realized he wasn't in control anymore. People weren't just leaving. They were being removed, erased, and it wasn't him pulling the trigger. By Friday, Albert's eyes were sunken. He hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. The maid asked him twice if he was sick. He told her once more and she was going out the window. She left the tray and ran. He didn't touch the food, just stared at the list of names he'd written 3 months earlier. All of them dead or gone, except one, Gallo. He was still standing, still moving, still talking. And now, Tony Romano was whispering in his ear. The walls weren't closing in anymore. They were on fire. That night, Albert called an emergency meeting with what remained of his loyal men. Half didn't show. The rest came late, nervous, sweating. He looked around the room and saw ghosts in real time. Men who used to pull triggers without blinking now struggled to hold eye contact. He spoke for 15 minutes about the old days, about what it cost to build this life, about blood loyalty and the price of forgetting it. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, he stood, and he said 5 words that felt more like a curse than a plan. "We finish this next week." Then he walked out, alone. No one followed. Back in the penthouse, the city buzzed beneath him like a hive of knives. The girl in the red dress was waiting in the hallway again. This time, her mouth moved clearly. Albert read the words on her lips. "You know how this ends." He didn't blink. He didn't look away. He just whispered back under his breath, "I was dead a long time ago." The restaurant was quiet. Too quiet for a Friday. Albert sat in the back booth of Ragusa's, the old Sicilian place on Bay 9. It used to be a neutral spot, a place where even men with war in their eyes put their guns away. But nothing was neutral anymore. Not with Tony Romano alive, not with two of Albert's oldest killers missing. Albert didn't eat, didn't drink. He just sat there, under the low amber light, fingers tapping the oak table slowly, tick, 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 like a fuse winding down. He knew Tony would come. That was the game. And Tony? He always liked games. At 11:34 p.m., the door opened. The man who walked in wasn't the young punk Albert remembered. He was older now, thicker around the waist, hair receding, face a little softer. But the eyes, still sharp, still dangerous. Tony moved through the restaurant like he owned the air. Albert didn't stand. He just watched him come. Tony slid into the booth across from him. No words, no handshake. Just sat there like no time had passed. After a long silence, Tony finally spoke. "You look like shit, Al." Albert didn't smile. "I've buried better men than you since lunch." Tony chuckled softly. "There he is. Same mouth, same stare. Heard you haven't been sleeping." Albert lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking sign on the wall. "You been asking about me?" "More like listening," Tony said. "The streets are loud these days, and your name's not as heavy as it used to be." Albert took a drag. "You always wanted my spot. You just didn't have the balls to kill me for it." "I didn't want your spot," Tony said. "I wanted out. You were building an empire on bodies and cement. I wanted a life, a family." Albert scoffed. "You ran." "I survived." They sat in that for a moment. Tony leaned in. "You know I didn't come back for revenge, right? I didn't come back to take your seat. Gallo offered me money, protection. I told him I'd think about it. The truth is, I came back for one reason." Albert flicked ash into a cold plate. "Enlighten me." "I wanted to see if you were still you," Tony said, "or just a myth in a suit." Albert stared at him, and then slowly smiled. "You're looking at the last man in the city who doesn't blink when blood hits the walls." Tony nodded. That might be true. He reached into his coat. Albert tensed, but it was just a letter. He slid it across the table. Albert didn't touch it. Tony exhaled. "Read it when I'm gone. It's from Frankie." Albert froze. Frankie. Frankie Bolano, one of the two who disappeared after Albert sent them after Tony. Albert narrowed his eyes. "Where is he?" Tony leaned back. "Dead." A long pause. "Mendez killed him," Tony added. "Your own Cuban ghost. Gallo flipped him months ago. Victor's dead too, shot through the eye. They dumped him in a swamp outside Jersey." Albert's throat burned, but he didn't move. Tony went on. "You sent 2 legends after a man you thought was still a boy. You should have sent more." "You got lucky," Albert muttered. "No," Tony said, voice dropping. "I got smart." Albert finally grabbed the letter, didn't open it, just held it. "Why didn't you come at me directly?" he asked. Tony shrugged. "Because that's what they expect. Gallo, the commission, the feds, they all want to show, they want to see you lose your mind, make a scene. That's not how you kill a king." Albert raised an eyebrow. Tony smiled sadly. "You make everyone stop believing in him." After Tony left, Albert sat there alone. The letter unopened, the restaurant empty. He finally ripped it open with a knife. Inside was a single page, typewritten, short. "Al, I knew you wouldn't get this unless I was gone. Tony didn't kill me. I volunteered. We both knew what was coming. Gallo owns too many of the commission now. The walls were coming in, and you didn't see it. You still think fear can hold a crumbling house together. It can't. I loved you like a brother, but this war, it's already over. You're just the only one still fighting it. Don't let them take your ending." Frankie ... Albert folded the letter. Didn't tear it, didn't curse, didn't scream. He just sat there, staring at the table, while the truth settled in like poison. By dawn, Albert was back in his penthouse. He stood by the window watching the city crack under early sunlight. His hands didn't shake anymore. His mind didn't spin. It was like something inside him had clicked, something final. There were no more cards left to play. He wasn't going to reclaim the throne. He wasn't going to flip the commission. He wasn't going to win this war. But he wasn't going to beg for mercy either. And he wasn't going to fade quietly. The myth would not die in bed. He made 3 calls, one to a safe house he hadn't used in 10 years, one to a supplier who owed him favors from Havana, and one to his tailor. That evening, Albert walked through the lobby of the Park Sheraton Hotel, freshly shaved, suit-pressed, shoes polished like mirrors. He looked like royalty, but the shine wasn't for vanity. It was for the cameras. He knew they were watching. The feds, the commission, gallows rats. Everyone wanted to see what Albert Anastasia would do now that his empire was ash. He lit a cigar and made a show of tipping the bellboy $5. He smiled at the front desk clerk. He walked into the barbershop like he didn't have a care in the world. Chair number non gavete. That was his chair. His barber, old Charlie, looked up and gave a weak smile. The kind of smile that said, "I know this isn't going to end well." Albert sat down, tossed his coat over the armrest. "Just a trim," he said. "Nothing fancy." Charlie nodded. The scissors came out. Albert closed his eyes and waited. They came at 10:45 a.m. 2 men, suits, clean-cut, professional, no words, just bullets. 6 of them, 2 in the back of the head, 4 to the body. Albert never opened his eyes. The newspapers called it the execution of the executioner. The radio called it the end of an era. The commission called it necessary. Gallo celebrated with cigars and champagne. And the city, it breathed. But deep in the bones of Brooklyn, in the shadows of the docks, in the alleyways that still stank of blood and ambition, Albert Anastasia's name didn't fade. Because men like him don't vanish. They haunt, not with justice, not with regret, but with reminders that once a man stood alone against the world, and the world blinked first. Dead men don't breathe. But that morning, as the blood pooled beneath chair number 4 at the Park Sheraton Hotel, and the echo of 6 gunshots still rattled down the marble hall, some swore they heard a breath. Just one, like defiance clinging to a ruined body. Albert Anastasia lay slumped, head twisted unnaturally, eyes glassy but open. He hadn't drawn his weapon, hadn't shouted, hadn't begged. He had gone out like a man who knew exactly what was coming. The shooters were gone before the barber even dropped the scissors. The papers said the job was clean, professional, quick. What they didn't say was this: no one touched the body, not for 12 full minutes. Even the cops who arrived first stood at the door, looking in like they were staring at a shrine built from blood. It wasn't just fear. It was something older, something colder. The room felt wrong, too still, like the building was holding its breath. The coroner declared him dead at 11:12 a.m. 2 bullets to the back of the skull, 4 to the torso, standard mob execution. Same kind that Albert had ordered 100 times before. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They called it closure. The press celebrated. Gallo's crew drank for 2 nights straight. The commission sent out statements about stability. But for the men who knew him, for the old bones of Brooklyn street corners, for the men who once buried bodies in his name, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a bad dream, like the city had taken out its spine. 2 days after the funeral, a low-level numbers runner named Leo Costa slit his own throat in a Harlem apartment. No note, no enemies, no reason, just blood everywhere, and on the wall, drawn with shaking fingers. I saw him. 1 week later, a shipment of unmarked Cuban cigars meant for Gallo's personal stash arrived at his warehouse in Flatlands. Inside the wooden box, not cigars, teeth, 12 of them, filed down, broken. Gallo's men tried to spin it as a prank from a rival crew, but everyone who worked under Albert knew that calling card. It was a message. Simple, personal. He's not done. The FBI tried to bury the rumors. They leaned on the press, pushed out stories of internal power grabs and jealous lieutenants, but it was too late. The myth was awake now. Some said Albert never died, that it was a body double, that he was in Cuba or Sicily or holed up in a federal safe house ready to flip the whole commission. Others said he did die, but his ghost didn't, that he walked Brooklyn's back alleys after midnight, dressed in the same suit he died in. whispering into the ears of weak men. A few whispered something worse, that he wasn't haunting them. He was recruiting. Inside the commission, panic grew. Gallo stopped attending meetings. He refused to leave his mansion in New Jersey, paranoid, shaking, high on pills and sleeping in windowless rooms. He accused his closest men of plotting to poison him, accused his own brother of hiding letters written in Albert's name. He ordered his food tasted, had his barber interrogated, and still, the dreams came. Every night, same scene. Chair number, non-gavada, same sound, breathing. Meanwhile, in the streets, something strange began to unfold. Small crews started going dark. Not cops, not hits, just gone. Guys who'd once run collections, enforced gambling rings, controlled card clubs. They stopped answering phones, stopped showing up. Apartments empty, lockers cleaned out, no blood, no ransom, just absence. And every place they vanished from, the same symbol appeared, scratched into walls, carved into wood, burned into leather, a simple crown, 5 sharp points, no initials, no name, but everyone knew who wore that crown, the Lord High Executioner. Costello stayed quiet through it all. He tried to keep order, tried to calm the heads, but something was shifting. The balance was gone. They had removed the monster from the house, but they hadn't locked the door behind him. And then came the tape. It arrived in a small black envelope delivered to the doorstep of a senior FBI agent in Manhattan. No postage, no return address, just a tape and a note. Play alone. He did, and what he heard made him vomit on the floor. It was a voice, familiar, rough, low, measured, Albert's voice. You killed a man who had already buried himself. You took a crown built from your own cowardice. I didn't die in that chair. You did. I gave this world fear, and you gave it paper. I gave it silence, and you gave it politics. I want you to know I'm still here. I never left, and I'm not coming for the commission. I'm coming for belief. When no one sleeps, I've won. They tried to track the voice, analyze the cadence, trace the tape. Nothing. It was like it had come from under the earth. Weeks passed. Then bodies started appearing. Not mobsters, not gangsters, lawyers, accountants, judges, all men who'd helped break Albert's empire. All found the same way. Mouths sewn shut, hands broken at the knuckles, one bullet in the heart, the crown carved into their chest. The press tried to call it the work of a copycat. But nobody bought it. Not in Brooklyn, not where his name still echoed in sewer pipes and stairwells. And then, it stopped. Just like that. No more messages, no more deaths, no more signs. Like whatever it was had passed through or was waiting. Gallo died 6 months later of natural causes. Heart attack, they said. But the coroner noted scratches on the inside of his throat, like he'd been trying to scream with no voice. In the years that followed, the name Albert Anastasia became legend. They never found who sent the tape. They never found the truth about the missing soldiers. They never identified the killer of the so-called Justice Line victims. But the symbol, the 5-point crown, kept showing up, etched into prison walls, tattooed on the hands of lifers, drawn in blood at unsolved murder scenes, and always the same phrase whispered, "He doesn't sleep." Because maybe Albert didn't survive that day in the barber's chair. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe men like him don't need to survive. Maybe they just need to be remembered, with enough fear to live forever. The year turned, but the shadows didn't move. Winter melted into spring. Spring limped into summer, and the city acted like Albert Anastasia had never existed. The newspapers stopped printing his name. The commission appointed new captains, new lieutenants, clean-cut guys with law degrees and quiet wives. Gallo's people said they were modernizing the life, turning rackets into investments, hits into silence, and death into paperwork. But something didn't sit right. Fear wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. And when it came back, it came quietly. It started with Sammy Grasso, a mid-tier earner turned investment consultant. He'd been running laundry money through a crypto scam in Midtown, pretending to be clean. He was the first to talk about the dreams. Sat up in a therapy group in Soho and said, "I keep seeing this man. Slicked back hair, Eyes like knives. Every night. Same suit, same stare. He doesn't blink. The room laughed until he shot himself 3 days later. In the middle of 9th Avenue. Broad daylight, no note. Just one word scratched into his forearm with a paperclip. Watching. Then came the reports from Cell Block 6 at Sing Sing. Inmates refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, screaming about a man standing outside their cell, just watching, never speaking. One guard reported a prisoner carving a crown into his wall until his fingers bled. When asked why, the man replied, "He said if I didn't draw it, I'd wake up with my mouth gone." They moved him to psych. He chewed through his own tongue 2 days later. Should have been superstition. Should have been prison madness, street paranoia, urban legend crap. But then the tapes started again. This time, they weren't mailed. They were left in places no one should have been able to reach. One in the glove box of a judge's locked car, one on a priest's confession booth seat, though the booth was locked from the inside, and one, somehow, slipped into the drawer of an FBI agent's desk inside a secure Manhattan field office. Each tape, the same gravel voice. "You buried a man, but you forgot to bury his name." The commission met behind closed doors, terrified, paranoid, disintegrating. They'd tried to wipe Albert's memory, replace him with sanitized history, bury him under paperwork and headlines, but something had gone wrong. And not just symbolically, not metaphorically, something real. They blamed Gallo first, even in death. "His crew's playing ghost stories," someone said, "trying to scare the rest of us." But Gallo had been in the ground 6 months. Autopsy photos leaked eventually, black lines across his throat inside out, like something had clawed upward. Doctors said it was spasms. Men who knew Albert said he finally shut Gallo up for good. Then, the old-timers started dying, not gunned down, not poisoned. They just stopped waking up. No signs of struggle, no signs of trauma, except for the eyes, wide open, frozen in terror, and beside each of them, a single item, a tooth, filed, broken, clean. Some said it was a cult, a revenge group made up of loyalists who survived the purge of Albert's fall. Former hitmen, enforcers, maybe even retired captains who wanted to see the old world restored. An underground faction willing to kill just to keep his myth alive. But no arrests were ever made. No names ever surfaced. The FBI called it low priority because fear isn't illegal. Yet, but in the streets, fear came roaring back. Corners once deemed safe turned quiet after dark. New crews hesitated to take old rackets. The barbershop where Albert was shot, abandoned. No buyer ever lasted. Every time someone tried to renovate, things happened. One worker fell through the floor and cracked his skull open, said he heard whispers right before it gave out. Another claimed the chair moved on its own at night. They eventually boarded it up. Locals started calling it the throne. They'd cross the street to avoid it, just in case the crown was watching. In one forgotten corner of the city, a street tagger started painting Albert's face on abandoned buildings. Not as a tribute, as a warning. Every piece had the same detail. Eyes wide, blood on the collar, a crown hovering behind his head like a ghost's hand, and underneath, 3 words in red spray. He never slept. At night, the city got colder, quieter. It wasn't crime that people feared. It was memory. It was his name. And then something truly unexplainable happened. A man named Joseph Morello, a retired judge who'd signed off on a dozen warrants targeting Albert's empire, was found dead in his upstate home. Not in the bedroom, not on the porch, in his bathtub, filled with blood, but not his. His body was untouched. Autopsy confirmed it. The blood wasn't human. It tested wrong. No match in any database, no animal signature, no human markers. The lab report simply wrote, unknown origin. Not consistent with forensic standards. The judge's walls were covered in Latin phrases, scribbled in what looked like charcoal. Investigators didn't translate them publicly, but one line was translated by a private researcher who leaked it anonymously. He who dies by the blade of death becomes the breath of death. Suddenly, no one wanted to be associated with Anastasia, not even in whispers, not even in stories. People who once bragged about shaking his hand, now denied ever meeting him. His name disappeared from historical books. Academics who wrote about his legacy began pulling down their work, claimed pressure, claimed fear, but no one knew from where. Until the night Costello disappeared, not died, not assassinated, not even seen, just gone. His home untouched, no signs of struggle, dinner still warm on the table, papers still in the fireplace, shoes by the door. But no Costello. Security footage went blank for 7 minutes. When it returned, the front door was open, and one thing had changed. On the living room mirror, 5 lines scratched deep into the glass, like fingers, like claws. The commission met one final time that year. Quiet, nervous, fractured. They didn't talk about Albert, not directly. They used phrases like the legacy or the shadow, but what they all meant was the same. It never left. And in a bar in South Brooklyn, 3 kids sat drinking, bragging about their father's days in the mob. One of them made a joke about the guy who died in a barber chair like a little bitch. The lights flickered. All 3 went silent. The bartender stopped wiping the glass, and a man at the end of the bar, dressed in a dark gray suit, stood up without a word and walked out. No one had noticed him come in. No one ever saw him again. But later that night, the one who made the joke swallowed his own tongue in his sleep. No drugs, no trauma, just fear. Too much of it. Because when you build your power on violence and fear and silence, you don't disappear when you die. You become the thing that men whisper about when the lights go out. You become the breath in the silence. You become the hum in the walls. You become the story that keeps sleeping men awake. And Albert? Albert never slept, and so now, neither does the city. Detective Dominic Falco had seen a lot in his 29 years with the NYPD. Junkies with needles still in their necks. Wives smiling over dead husbands with butcher knives in their hands. Cops who wore their badges like shields until the money got heavy enough to bend the metal. But nothing ever got to him. Not really, until the file landed on his desk. It was thin, tucked into an old brown folder with a red stamp on the front. Deceased, do not pursue. Inside were a dozen yellowed pages, brittle like they might crack under the weight of truth. A few crime scene photos from the Park Sheraton barbershop, a blurred surveillance shot, a list of suspects no one ever followed up on. At the very bottom, clipped with rusting wire, Anastasia Albert, case closed, cause multiple gunshot wounds, status terminated. Falco stared at the photo of Albert's corpse, slumped, eyes still open, face barely touched by death. Most corpses look surprised. Albert looked like he was waiting. Captain O'Hara had dropped the file on Falco's desk that morning without a word, just a look. Falco had gotten used to O'Hara's looks. They meant, do this quietly, or don't dig too deep. This one meant, be careful. Falco didn't ask why the file had been reopened. He already knew. Rumors, sightings, whispers on the street, guys flipping on cases unrelated to Albert suddenly begging for protection from the Crown. And the last 2 informants who dropped Albert's name. One had a stroke in a holding cell. The other tried to eat his own thumb. Falco wasn't superstitious, but he was tired and curious. So he started digging. He started at the beginning. The docks. That was Albert's original turf. Long before the suits and hotels and the legend, he'd been just another ghost in a sleeveless undershirt, breaking backs for $1 a crate. The longshoremen were different now. Unionized, corporate, softened by decades of politics. But the bones of the place were still the same salt in the air, same rust on the chains, same hush in certain corners. Falco found Mario Andretti, 78 years old, retired union rep, one of the last men alive who had worked under Anastasia. They met at a fish market in Bensonhurst. Falco bought coffee and sat across from Mario at a wobbly plastic table. I ain't talked about him in 40 years, Mario said, eyes squinting through thick glasses. I'm not asking for secrets, Falco replied, just truths. Mario laughed. That's worse. He took a sip. Albert wasn't like the other guys. He didn't make speeches, didn't smile for cameras. But when he walked into a room, your body reacted, like cold water down the spine. Falco nodded. You ever meet a man, Mario went on, and just feel like if he wanted you gone, the world would erase you before you hit the floor? Falco didn't answer. Mario leaned forward. They say he's dead, but I think he just stopped pretending to be alive. That night, Falco reviewed the autopsy photos again. There were 6 bullet wounds, close range, clear kill. But something bothered him. The eyes, they didn't match the trauma. They weren't empty. They weren't afraid. They were expecting. He stared at the image until it blurred. Something itched at him. So he pulled the crime scene report again. A small detail no one had followed up on. A smear of blood outside the barber chair perimeter. Too far for a dying body to spray. Too high to be from a fall, like someone stood over the body and bled. Falco followed the next breadcrumb, the tapes. He pulled every incident report involving a VHS, cassette, or audio recording linked to Anastasia's post-death mythology. Most had been written off as hoaxes or ignored entirely. But one stood out. A Ezerkielen Zazit Venegi report, filed by a rookie agent out of the Newark FBI office. Said he received a tape by courier with no postmark, just the name Anastasia scrawled on the envelope. Falco tracked the agent, Gregory Luntz, now living in assisted care, nearly blind, pushing 90. He made the visit. Luntz was shriveled, bones in a blanket, but when Falco said the name Albert Anastasia, the old man's eyes opened wide. "You heard the tape?" Falco asked. Luntz just nodded. Slow. "You remember what it said?" Silence. Then a rasp. "It didn't say anything." Falco leaned in. "Then why did you file the report?" Luntz stared at the ceiling. "Because I could still hear it 3 days later, in my dreams, in the walls. I never played it out loud again." Falco left shaken. Not because of ghosts, but because the silence was too consistent, too rehearsed. Everyone who touched Albert's name seemed to shut down, not out of loyalty, out of fear that felt earned. Next stop was personal. Falco tracked down Teresa Bolano, daughter of Frankie Bolano, one of Albert's last loyal men. She ran a dry cleaning business in Carroll Gardens, pretended not to know who her father was, until Falco showed her the letter Frankie had left for Albert, the one Tony Romano handed over before the execution. She went quiet. "He told me," she said finally, "before he disappeared. He said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of what came after." After? He said he used to dream about Albert, but in the last dream, Albert didn't speak. She looked up. He smiled. Falco's head was spinning now. He couldn't tell if he was chasing a myth or walking into it. Every time he touched something from the past, it touched him back. And the dreams. They had started too. Just shadows for now. Footsteps, breathing, cold tile, a chair, and always a man in a suit. Never turning, never speaking. Then came the worst of it. Falco woke one night with a start, covered in sweat, but not from fear, from pain. His molar felt like it had been ripped out in his sleep, blood on the pillow. And in his bathroom mirror, 5 fingerprints on the glass, too large to be his, too perfect to be coincidence. He called O'Hara at 3 a.m., said he wanted off the case. O'Hara didn't argue, just said, "You're already in it. Walk soft." Then hung up. Falco boxed up the file, threw it in the river, burned the copies, tried to forget. But the dreams didn't stop. The whispers didn't stop. And one night, walking home late, he passed an alley he knew was empty and smelled cigars, cheap ones, exactly like the kind Albert used to smoke. He didn't turn around, because he knew if he did, he'd see him. Not a ghost, not a man, but a promise that no matter how many files get stamped. Closed. Albert Anastasia isn't. 3 weeks after Detective Falco walked away from the case, the city started cracking. Not in ways the public could see. Not bombs, not shootings, not bodies in the gutter. It was subtler than that. Men stopped talking. That was the first sign. Street guys, runners, cornermen, bookies, even old-timers who used to love telling war stories over drinks went quiet. Eyes shifted quicker, doors locked earlier, phones stopped getting answered. No one said Albert's name. Not because they forgot it, because they feared it might answer back. In the middle of this silence stood Vincent Arcuri, a former mob lawyer turned city councilman. Vincent had built his career out of burying the past. He'd been there when the old bosses fell, testifying in closed chambers, striking deals behind bulletproof glass. He'd smiled at reporters while giving eulogies for men he once paid off. And in his speeches, he said things like, "We have moved past the era of shadows. There is no place for ghosts in our politics. Albert Anastasia is dead and gone." He said those things on camera, and people clapped. But the city didn't. The city held its breath. Because you don't say a name like Albert's and walk away clean. Vincent's warning started with a sound. A knock. 3:08 a.m. 3 knocks, then silence. He lived alone. Gated building, cameras, armed doorman. No delivery scheduled. He got up, heart pounding, checked the hallway. Nothing. No one. He went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same rhythm. He asked the doorman. No one on the cameras, no one signed in. On the third night, he didn't answer the knock. And in the morning, his front door had 5 fingerprints burned into it. He went to the NYPD. They told him it was a prank. He asked for a security detail. They gave him a panic button. He installed 10 more cameras. He never saw a thing. Then came the letter. Typed on yellowing paper. No return address. Slipped under his office door despite a locked building. It read, "You made your living with lies. I made mine with truth. Yours are fading. Mine is rising. Say my name again, and I'll remind you why they feared it." No signature. Just a 5-pointed crown drawn in red ink. Vincent stopped doing interviews. He canceled speeches, stopped going to City Hall. His staff said he had a health issue. But they knew the truth. He was scared. Something he hadn't felt in decades. Meanwhile, the city's undercurrent shifted again. People started seeing things. A homeless woman on 45th claimed she saw a man in a gray suit standing outside the old Park Sheraton Hotel, just standing, for hours. When someone finally approached him, he was gone. Left behind, a single object on the ground, a tooth, filed, broken, white as snow. A priest at St. Dominic's swore a confessional light came on every night at the same time. No one inside, no sound. But the light never failed. And every morning, the wall inside the booth had a new name scratched into it. Names of dead men, all connected to Albert. The FBI reopened the case unofficially, quietly. They assigned Agent Reese Langford, a profiler out of Quantico, to gather intel. He lasted 9 days. On the 10th, he submitted a 1-line resignation letter. Some things aren't supposed to be solved. They found him the next week in the Catskills, living off-grid, burning paper in a steel barrel. One of the ashes pulled from the barrel showed traces of human teeth enamel. Back in the city, Falco tried to ignore it. He kept his head down, retired early, started drinking more, avoided alleys. But the dreams didn't stop. The man in the suit was closer now, no longer a shadow in the corner. Now he sat in the barber's chair, in Falco's head, facing him. And in the latest dream, he smiled. Then came the night everything snapped. 6 bars across Brooklyn were torched, all at the same time. No accelerants found, no security footage, no witnesses. But in the ashes, firefighters found something under the charred floor of the Velvet Room, the very spot where Albert had executed Nicky Mancuso years ago. A chair, old, metal framed, scorched but upright, and carved into the seat. He died sitting down, but he stood longer than all of you. That was the final straw. The commission called an emergency meeting, what remained of them anyway. 5 men, not the old giants, not capos or legends, just scared businessmen in expensive suits with high blood pressure and low courage. They met in a basement in Hell's Kitchen. No phones, no staff, no protection. And when they emerged, they had a new rule. No more hits, no more tribute, no more use of the name Anastasia, ever. He was declared outlawed, even in memory, a ghost too dangerous to mention. They said it was respect, but everyone knew it was fear, but it was too late. The myth had gotten too big. It had leaked into the sewers, the graffiti, the whispers in tenements. the dreams of every two-bit street enforcer who now left offerings, cigars, bullets, even roses, on random stoops and corners. They called them marks of mercy, left behind as tribute, so that maybe, just maybe, Albert would pass over their house without leaving a message carved into their door. In quiet corners of the city, people told stories again. They said Albert had never been real, that he was a collection of sins from every killer stitched together into one name. Others said he was too real, and that killing him only let his spirit escape the body. Some said he still walked, that he'd been seen, really seen, outside the Park Sheraton, that he'd aged, but only just, that he nodded at the night shift doorman before vanishing into the fog. In Carroll Gardens, a kid spray-painted the crown symbol across a precinct door. He was arrested, asked what it meant. He didn't answer, just grinned and said, "You should be more afraid of the things you can't charge." They put him in holding. In the morning, he was gone. Cameras caught nothing, his prints erased. The only thing left behind, a cigarette butt, still warm, still burning. Cuban, Albert's brand. And so, the city began to believe again. Not in justice, not in order, not in the commission, but in Albert, not as a man, as a force, a presence, a consequence. He no longer needed a body. He had something better. Memory. The most permanent weapon of all. The old guard was nearly gone. What was left of the commission had stopped holding meetings. Their territories were ghost towns, no collections, no movement, no answers. They had retreated into mansions surrounded by walls, alarms, and paranoia thick enough to choke on. But it didn't matter, because you can't fence out a whisper. And Albert Anastasia had become exactly that. A whisper wrapped in legend, fed by fear, sharpened by time. March 10th, 1958, 6 months after Albert's death. The newspapers ran an article headlined, "Mob Peace Declared Across 5 Boroughs, Truce Signed." But the street told a different story. Crews were vanishing, not shot, not flipped, just gone. It was like the city was being swallowed, one corner at a time. In a basement in Queens, Tommy Drago, one of the last enforcers still claiming loyalty to Gallo's bloodline, opened his fridge and found 6 bullets in the butter tray. No fingerprints, just a note. Still warm. He moved to Miami that same night, never came back. Even the cops started asking questions, not about crimes, about shadows. Detective Falco, now retired, was found standing outside the old Park Sheraton building at 2 a.m., wearing a long coat, eyes blank. A young officer asked if he was lost. Falco said nothing, just stared up at the building and whispered, "I hear him breathing." They took him home. He didn't remember being there, didn't remember saying it, but he remembered the sound, like someone exhaling through a bullet wound. Then came the uprising. Not a mob war, not a rebellion, something different, something older. They called themselves the 5 Points. A group of nobodies, according to the NYPD. Kids, street rats, ex-cons, men who'd never held real power, never had turf, never had names worth fearing, but they moved like ghosts, spoke in riddles. Dressed like they'd walked out of the 1930s, and everywhere they went they left behind the same calling card, a tooth, a crown, a phrase, "He doesn't sleep." At first the authorities thought it was just theater, a scare tactic, but then the killings started, precise, silent, poetic. A federal prosecutor investigating old Murder Inc. cases drowned in his own pool. No sign of struggle, lungs full of cigar ash. A city archivist working on a documentary about Anastasia was found hanging in his office, with his tongue stapled to a reel of film. An ex-capo turned pastor in Jersey was found frozen in a church freezer with the word "traitor" etched in the frost above his head. No fingerprints, no cameras, only silence and the symbol. Reporters tried to expose it, called it the Resurrection Cult. Some claimed it was orchestrated by a remaining member of Murder Inc. Others said it was psychological warfare, a group of mentally unstable men playing God in the ruins of a forgotten kingdom. But every time someone tried to dig deeper, they disappeared. One reporter, Sandra Esteban, published a piece titled, "Anastasia Never Slept, and Maybe He Never Died." She was last seen boarding the A train. Her Metro card was used once. She never came out. Her office found one thing left on her desk, a tooth in an ashtray, still warm. City officials begged for answers. The public demanded accountability. And for the first time in modern history, the NYPD called in a forensic occult specialist, Dr. Barrett King. He had worked international black site cases, mass hysteria outbreaks, and cult-related disappearances. When asked what he thought was happening in New York, he gave one answer. It's not crime. It's belief. And belief has a body count. He requested access to all known documents, footage, and reports regarding Albert Anastasia's death. He reviewed the tapes, he studied the crime scene, and on the third day, he resigned. When asked why, he said only, "That man didn't die." Something did, but not him. He moved to Norway within the month, changed his name. The 5 points became more than a rumor. They became a pattern. Bankers found their accounts frozen. Real estate moguls discovered their building deeds torn in half. Wall Street brokers woke up to find their cars reduced to ash. No one claimed responsibility. No names were dropped, just whispers. He's rebuilding, not his empire, his message. And in the Bronx, an old shoemaker named Vito, who hadn't said a word about the mob in 50 years, whispered to his grandson one night, "They thought he ruled with blood." But that wasn't it. He ruled because he made men remember what silence cost. You forget a man like that, and the city starts to rot. The boy asked who he was. The old man didn't answer, but he turned and looked toward the door like someone was standing there. On the anniversary of Albert's death, March 10th, something else happened, something final. The barber chair, chair number 4 from the Park Sheraton, had been stored in NYPD evidence for years, locked in a deep facility in Queens. That night, it vanished. No alarms, no footage, no signs of entry. Gone. In its place, a folded newspaper from 1957. Its headline, "Executioner Falls, Anastasia Gunned Down." Scrawled across it in red ink, "Not yet." It was the final omen and the beginning of the end. By morning, 8 men were dead. All former commission ties, all found in their homes, all with their mouths sewn shut. Each of them had a letter on their chest. Together, the bodies spelled, "Remember who built you." The city went quiet, like a held breath. Old enemies made peace. Cops stopped asking questions. The NYPD announced full cooperation with ongoing investigations, but offered no names, no theories, no arrests. Because deep down, everyone understood. You don't chase a shadow that's already in the room. You turn off the lights, you lock the door, and you pray it's not your name that gets whispered next. They tried to erase him, tried to silence the legacy. But in the end, the legacy erased them. Albert Anastasia wasn't just a man, he was a debt. And now, it was due. It was quiet now. But not the kind of quiet that comes after peace. It was the silence you get after something is already broken, when the dust hasn't settled, but the screaming has stopped. New York stood still, its 5 boroughs breathing slow, like a boxer who survived the round, but knows the next one will kill him. In basements and tenements and marble-walled boardrooms, people whispered about the crown, not the symbol, not the graffiti, the idea, the presence. Albert Anastasia wasn't just legend anymore. He was movement, a pressure, a constant reminder in the back of every coward's mind that no matter how modern the world became, no matter how many laws or corporations tried to polish the filth, there was always a man beneath it. In the smell of cigar smoke at the wrong hour of the night, in the dreams of guilty men, in the silence that follows a name. Albert Anastasia. He ruled by fear. He died by design. He lives by force. And every man who walks a street paved by his blood still walks with his permission. Epilogue. There's a building in Brooklyn no one will buy. Its windows are blacked out. Its front door never locks but never opens. A tooth sits in the middle of the front steps, polished, waiting. They say if you step on that tooth, you start dreaming. And if you dream long enough, you wake up in the chair, facing the mirror, hearing him breathe, and when you do, you never sleep again.